It was exactly 02:00 p.m. when I found myself standing in the middle of Morrison's bookstore, clutching the very first copy of my debut novel. The display table looked so hopeful, 15 books neatly stacked, a vase of flowers beside them, even a sign with my name in bold letters. And yet, the seats we'd set up remained painfully empty. The only footsteps I heard were strangers wandering in, asking if there was free wine or if I knew where the bathroom was. I told myself to smile, to act professional, but inside I felt like I was unraveling. I had dreamed of this moment for decades, the day I would finally hold my own book in my hands, the day my children would stand proudly beside me. Instead, they were miles away at a spa retreat with their in-laws, laughing in fluffy robes while I sat here invisible in my finest navy suit. The injustice cut deeper than I could explain. My children had known how much this launch meant to me. They had watched me rise before dawn to write, fall asleep over drafts, and sacrifice weekends for editing. They had heard me talk about this story, the one I carried in my heart since I was a young woman. And yet, when the day arrived, they dismissed it as just a book signing. That phrase echoed in my mind like a cruel refrain. I tried to steady myself, telling my heart to be grateful for the 3 books I managed to sell. Grateful for the kind stranger who said she admired my persistence. But when I drove home with boxes of unsold novels in the back seat, I felt humiliated. I had poured everything I had into this dream, and the people I loved most didn't care enough to show up. That night, standing in my living room, I noticed the family photos on my mantle in a new way. In every frame, I was slightly behind, cropped out, or blurred in the background, always present, but never truly seen, always supporting, but never supported. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. For years, I had told myself this was normal, that being taken for granted was just part of being a mother. But as I stared at those photos, I realized I was done being invisible. This wasn't only the worst day of my life, it was also the beginning of something else. What I didn't know then was that this heartbreak would lead me down a path of clarity, empowerment, and decisions that would change everything. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, you need to know the story that came before the decades of sacrifice that built up to this single, devastating afternoon. When people looked at me, they often saw a woman who lived a quiet, ordinary life. A retired English teacher from Cedar Rapids, the kind of person who collected classic novels and drank too much tea. But behind that quiet exterior was a lifetime of sacrifice that very few ever bothered to notice. I spent 35 years teaching high school students how to love literature, how to think critically, and how to find their voice on paper. Day after day, I poured myself into the children of other families while raising 2 of my own, Jason and Megan, mostly alone. Their father decided one afternoon that marriage and family life no longer suited him. He left when Jason was 12 and Megan was 9, chasing a dream of freedom that never included us. From that day forward, I became everything: mother, father, provider, counselor, and cheerleader. There were nights when I graded essays until midnight, only to get up at 05:00 the next morning to work a tutoring shift before school. Every extra paycheck went to braces, field trips, and sports uniforms. Later, it went to tuition checks: $47,000 for Jason's degree, $52,000 for Megan's. I can still remember sitting in that cold bursar's office, signing papers with hands that shook, praying my bank account would stretch just one more semester. And it wasn't only tuition. When Jason married Emily, I contributed $15,000 toward the wedding. When Megan walked down the aisle with David, I gave $18,000 to help them start their life together. Then came the down payments, $25,000 for Jason's first house, $20,000 for Megan's condo. Every time they asked, I said yes, even when it meant postponing my own needs. I wore the same winter coat for 10 years, patched it until the fabric thinned, because their dreams mattered more. It didn't stop with money. When the grandchildren came along, I became the safety net yet again. 500 hours of babysitting a year, every year, for a decade. Pickups from school, sleepovers, birthday cakes baked from scratch. I was the dependable one, the one who never canceled, the one who never said no. And yet, when I think back, the acknowledgement was so thin it almost disappears. A perfunctory birthday card? A quick thank you text? Grandchildren who knew their other grandmother's favorite restaurant but didn't know mine. I convinced myself this was love in its own way, that being needed was the same as being cherished. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The anger didn't come all at once. It built slowly, layered between exhaustion and disappointment, until it hummed under my skin like a low electric current. For years, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being too sensitive. But the truth was always there. I had given everything, and in return, I had become invisible. By the time my book launch arrived, that invisible weight was already pressing down on me. I just didn't know yet how heavy it would become, or how brutally the people I loved would confirm what I feared all along, that to them, I was always the background character. The day of my book launch should have been one of the proudest milestones of my life. Instead, it became the sharpest wound I had ever carried. At exactly 02:00 p.m., I stood in Morrison's bookstore, straightening the display table over and over again, as if lining up the corners of my novels would somehow summon the people who were supposed to be there. 15 copies of Second Chances waited under the soft glow of a lamp, the cover shining like a promise. I had dressed in my best navy suit, applied my makeup twice just to be sure, and walked in with trembling hands but a hopeful heart. But hope has a cruel way of fading when the seats stay empty. The only sounds were the squeak of the bookstore door, the soft shuffling of strangers, and the rain tapping against the windows like a slow metronome. A college student drifted past me, asking if I had free bookmarks. An elderly man squinted at the cover, only to ask if it came in large print. Each question was a tiny cut, reminding me they weren't there for me. Not really. By 04:00 p.m., the truth sat heavy in my chest. My children were not coming. Jason was off at a spa day his mother-in-law had arranged, and Megan had decided it would feel too awkward to come without the rest of the family. My grandchildren, the ones I had rocked to sleep and ferried to school for years, were painting their nails and giggling in fluffy bathrobes while I sat alone, trying to smile at strangers who didn't know my name. 3 books sold. That was the grand total. 1 to the kind-hearted owner of the store who didn't want me to feel so small. 1 to a retired colleague who stopped by out of pity. And 1 to a stranger who said she admired my persistence, though I could tell she was simply being kind. I packed the remaining boxes into the trunk of my car as the sky turned from gray to black, and I drove home in silence. Every bump in the road made the books shift like they were mocking me, proof of years of effort that meant nothing to the people who mattered most. When I walked through my front door, the quiet pressed in like a weight. I poured myself a glass of wine, set it on the table, and looked up at the mantel where my family's photos sat. For the first time, I saw them differently. In Jason's graduation photo, I was standing just behind his in-laws. In Megan's wedding portrait, I had been cropped out of half the pictures. In birthday after birthday, I was there in the background, cake in hand, smile on my face, but never at the center. Never the one celebrated. Always present, always dependable, but never truly seen. And that night, something broke inside me, but it wasn't despair. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that feels like a burn at first, sharp and searing, but then leaves behind a strange calm. For decades, I had believed my worth was tied to how much I gave, how reliably I showed up. But in that moment, I realized that being indispensable wasn't the same as being loved. I had been invisible in my own family for too long. That night, I promised myself it would end. I didn't yet know exactly how, but I knew this. I was done being everyone's safety net while being no one's priority. That was the night grief began to harden into resolve, and by morning, I would start taking back the power I had surrendered for far too long. By the time the sun rose the next morning, my sadness had hardened into something sharper. I brewed my coffee, set it on the kitchen table, and pulled out a yellow legal pad. If I was going to stop being invisible, I needed to see my life written down in black and white. I started listing everything I had given over the years, not as memories this time, but as numbers. Jason's tuition, $47,000. Megan's tuition, $52,000. Jason's wedding contribution, $15,000. Megan's wedding contribution, $18,000. Down payment for Jason's house, $25,000. For Megan's condo, $20,000. Emergency loans scattered over the years, easily $12,000. And then there was babysitting 500 hours a year for 10 years. If I had charged for it, it would have been worth tens of thousands more. As the numbers stacked up, the total was staggering. Nearly $200,000 in direct financial support, and that was without counting the years of my time, my health, my quiet sacrifices that had no price tag. For the first time, I saw it clearly. I wasn't just the dependable mother. I had been the engine keeping their lives moving forward. And in return, a forgotten book launch, and a lifetime of being treated like a convenience. Something inside me clicked into place. I wasn't going to beg for recognition anymore. I was going to take control. I picked up the phone and set 3 appointments for Monday. At 09 a.m., I would meet with my lawyer to restructure my will. At 11 a.m., I would sit down with the bank to discuss setting up trust funds. And at 02 p.m., I would review everything with my financial advisor to make sure every decision was airtight. My life had been about giving. Now, it was about defining what I wanted those gifts to mean. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my sister Nora in Phoenix. She had been asking me to visit for 2 decades, always telling me her guest room was ready. We hadn't spoken deeply in far too long, but when her voice came through the line, I felt an ache of relief. I told her about the book launch, about the spa day, about the years of being everyone's last priority. She listened the way sisters do, without judgment, just with steady love. And for the first time in years, I let myself lean into that love. When I hung up, I felt lighter, supported. Not by the children who were supposed to stand beside me, but by someone who had never forgotten who I was. By Sunday evening, my sadness had given way to anticipation. My appointments were set. My plan was in motion. And my heart, though bruised, was steadier than it had been in years. I didn't know how my children would react when they discovered the changes I was making. I didn't know if they would understand, or if they would call me cruel. But I did know this for the first time in decades. I was writing my own story instead of being written into someone else's margins. And tomorrow, I would walk into those offices not as a forgotten mother, but as a woman who finally remembered her worth. When Monday arrived, I was ready, for once in my life. I walked into my lawyer's office with my back straight, not asking, not apologizing, deciding. By the time I left his desk, my entire estate was rewritten. The documents were signed, notarized, and real. I thought I had prepared myself for the storm that would follow, but nothing quite steels you for facing your own children when you finally stop playing the role they expect. It was late that week when they came to my house. Jason, Megan, their spouses, all of them standing in my living room like a jury ready to hand down a verdict. But the difference this time was that I wasn't on trial. I was delivering the sentence. I told them plainly. I had established educational trusts for my 3 grandchildren. Each trust would hold $75,000, enough to cover their schooling from kindergarten through graduate school. But there were conditions. The children would need to maintain a genuine relationship with me: phone calls, visits, letters that weren't prompted by holidays or obligations. If they chose not to, the money would be rerouted to literacy programs. I watched their faces twist as the weight of my words sank in. For once, I wasn't pleading for their understanding. I was stating facts. Then I told them the rest. Jason and Megan would each inherit $10,000. Not nothing, but not the fortune they had assumed was waiting. The remainder of my estate would go partly to the local library, the food bank, the animal shelter, and the rest to my sister Nora, the one who had shown me unwavering love when they couldn't be bothered to show up at all. The silence broke like glass shattering. Their outrage filled the room: accusations that I was being cruel, manipulative, unwell. They said I was acting out of anger, out of spite, but as they raged, I felt strangely calm, like I had finally stepped outside of a cage I hadn't realized I'd built around myself. And then, when their voices grew the loudest, I told them the truth. The diagnosis: stage 3 pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. Their faces drained of color. They begged to know why I hadn't told them, why I had kept it hidden. I told them because I needed to see them for who they really were. I needed to know if they would notice me, love me, show up for me without the looming shadow of death to guilt them into it. And when the book launch came, my supposed farewell, they had chosen spa robes and champagne over my final accomplishment. I explained that my novel wasn't just a story. It was my love letter to life, my way of leaving behind something of myself. That afternoon in the bookstore was never meant to be about sales. It was meant to be about goodbye. And they weren't there. For the first time, they had nothing to say. I told them what I had learned. Painfully, but clearly, love shows up. It doesn't wait for convenience. It doesn't hide behind excuses. It doesn't put someone last while pretending they matter. They left that day shaken, their pride stripped away, their illusions shattered. I closed the door behind them and poured myself another glass of wine. Not as a defeated woman, but as someone who had finally chosen herself. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel invisible. I felt strong. And though I didn't know what the future would hold, whether my family would step up or continue to falter, I knew this much: the next chapter of my life, however long it lasted, would be written on my terms. And yet, I had no idea that an even greater twist was still waiting, one that would test every decision I had made. In the weeks after that confrontation, something unexpected happened. My phone began to ring, not with requests, but with conversations. Jason called, just to ask how my day was going. Megan showed up one evening with homemade soup, the kind she had never made before, because she finally remembered my favorite wasn't Italian, but a simple chicken broth with herbs. My grandchildren started stopping by after school, their backpacks spilling across my living room floor as they told me about their teachers and projects. For the first time in years, they wanted to know me, not just what I could do for them. They asked my favorite color. They asked about the books I loved. They even listened to the stories I told about my childhood, the ones I thought no one cared to hear. It was bittersweet, because part of me wondered if it was guilt driving them. But over time, I began to feel something different. It wasn't frantic or performative anymore. It felt real. And then came the twist I never expected. At my next oncology appointment, my doctor looked at me with a kind of stunned disbelief. The scans showed my tumor had shrunk by 60%. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer doesn't just retreat like that, but there it was, undeniable. I walked out of that office feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. I wasn't cured. Not yet. But I wasn't dying tomorrow either. I had been given a gift: more time, more clarity, more of a chance to see what my family might become if they continued to choose love. And yet, I didn't undo the choices I had made. I kept the will exactly as it was, the trusts, the conditions, the donations, because this wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about legacy. I wanted my children and grandchildren to remember, long after I was gone, that love is not automatic. It is built, nurtured, and proven. And money, no matter how much, could never replace the simple act of showing up. Looking back now, I realize the best revenge was never about cutting anyone out or writing anyone off. The best revenge was teaching them how to love me properly and then giving them the chance to do it. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. We don't need to burn ourselves out to keep everyone else warm. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is step back, demand to be seen, and let the people around us rise to the challenge. If my story touched you, I'd love to hear yours. Share it in the comments, because your voice matters. And if you believe love should always show up, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because at the end of the day, love isn't about the grand gestures, it's about presence. And that is worth more than any inheritance.